There is a version of an avoidant that almost nobody gets to see, and it appears only under one condition. Not during conflict, not during the long stretches of requested space, not during any of the conversations where they explain their limits with such calm articulacy. It appears the moment their system registers that a departure has already occurred rather than being threatened, and what emerges is so completely unlike the person who spent months withholding that it can seem like watching a different individual entirely. The warmth arrives suddenly and in volume. The availability becomes total. The words that were impossible to extract for years appear unprompted, and almost everything about this transformation is the opposite of what it appears to be, which is why so many people who had genuinely finished find themselves back inside something they had already survived leaving, the specific trigger that produces the surge. An avoidant does not respond to distance. This is the fact that makes their behavior so consistently misread, because distance is what they claim to want and what they engineer at every opportunity. Distance is comfortable. Distance is the resting state. What produces the surge is something structurally different, the removal of the assumption that the connection remains recoverable. That assumption is the load-bearing element of the entire arrangement, and it operates almost entirely beneath conscious thought. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant maintained an internal model in which the other person constituted a fixed feature of the landscape, available whenever they chose to return, requiring no maintenance to remain in place. This model is what permitted every withdrawal, because withdrawal only costs nothing if the thing being withdrawn from persists unchanged. The model was never examined precisely because it was never contradicted. What breaks it is not an announcement. Announcements are absorbed easily, because an announcement is still a communication, and communications indicate ongoing engagement. What breaks the model is the arrival of a specific quality that the avoidance system detects long before conscious recognition catches up: the disappearance of expectation. When someone is finished, they stop addressing the better version of the avoidant that existed in their mind, the projected figure they were speaking to whenever they asked for more or expressed disappointment. Every complaint contained an implicit compliment. Its absence is what registers. There is a second detection mechanism operating alongside the first, and it concerns the disappearance of correction. Throughout the relationship, the other person routinely adjusted the avoidance account of events, offering an alternative reading when their version was self-serving, pointing out what had actually occurred when their memory had softened it. This function was experienced as friction and resented accordingly, but it performed something essential. It kept the avoidance understanding of reality tethered to something outside themselves. A person who is finished stops correcting, because correction is an investment. The avoidant experiences this as finally being allowed to be right, and the sensation is initially pleasant. What they do not recognize is that agreement offered by someone who has stopped caring is not agreement at all. There is a third signal, subtler than either, involving the quality of the other person's attention during ordinary interaction. Presence has a texture that cannot be faked in either direction, and its withdrawal is detectable even when every observable behavior remains identical. Conversations continue, courtesy is maintained, logistics are handled, and something underneath all of it has been switched off. The avoidant cannot identify what has changed, because nothing has changed at the level they know how to examine. They simply find themselves working harder to produce responses that used to arrive automatically, and the increased effort registers as a problem with the connection rather than as evidence of its conclusion. The detection is immediate, and the interpretation lags by weeks or months. During the interval, the avoidant experiences relief because pressure has lifted, and pressure was always the variable their defenses tracked. Underneath that relief, a background process begins running that they do not report on and cannot stop. They find themselves checking without registering that they are checking. They notice absences they would not previously have tracked. The quality of the calm is subtly wrong, and although they cannot articulate why, the wrongness accumulates. The surge arrives when the background process completes. It does not build gradually, and it does not announce itself. It appears at full intensity, frequently triggered by something trivial, and the person experiencing it has no framework for what is happening because nothing in their history has produced this state before. Every previous separation left the door open. This one did not, and a system that has never encountered a closed door has no procedure for the sensation. There is a further element that determines the timing, and it explains why the surge so often arrives long after the ending rather than during it. Feeling requires resources that proximity consumes. During the relationship, the avoidant frequently had too little available to experience their own attachment clearly, which is why they could end something significant while genuinely feeling almost nothing. Once contact stops, the drain stops, and what returns is not merely calm but access to everything that was inaccessible. The attachment surface is intact, in a person who concluded some time earlier that it no longer existed. Why the rush is not the thing it resembles. What emerges during the surge is genuinely felt, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to evaluate correctly. The avoidant is not performing. The intensity is real, the words are sincere, and the sense of transformation is entirely convincing to the person experiencing it. Understanding what it actually consists of requires separating two things that feel identical from inside. The first is want, which arrives on its own, requires nothing, and can appear at full strength in someone with no ability whatsoever to sustain closeness. The second is capacity, which is built slowly through repeated tolerance of the discomfort that proximity generates, developing over years and usually with considerable difficulty. An avoidant in the grip of genuine want frequently possesses no more capacity than they had at the moment they left, and they cannot detect the difference, because want feels exactly like readiness. There's a second distinction that matters as much. The surge is a threat response rather than an expression of love, generated by a system detecting an imminent and irreversible loss. Threat responses produce enormous energy, complete focus, and a temporary override of every ordinary limitation, which is why the avoidant during this period can suddenly do things that were impossible for years. They can communicate clearly, they can express feeling directly, they can be available without hesitation. None of this indicates new capability. It indicates a system operating in emergency mode, and emergency mode is by definition temporary. This explains the pattern that follows reconciliation with such reliability that it can be described in advance. The emergency resolves once the connection is restored, because restoration is what the alarm was demanding. With the threat removed, the system returns to baseline, and baseline is the person who left. The extraordinary availability recedes over a period of weeks, the communication reverts, and the original pattern reestablishes itself, usually faster than it developed the first time because the ground has already been mapped. There is a third element worth naming, which is what the surge reveals about the years preceding it. An avoidant who suddenly demonstrates a capacity for expression, presence, and vulnerability at the exact moment it is required to prevent a departure has demonstrated that the capacity existed throughout. It was simply never deployed when deploying it would have cost something. This is the observation that most people arrive at eventually, and it is accurate. The surge is not evidence of growth, but evidence of what was always available and always withheld. It is worth being precise about how the surge feels from inside, because its subjective texture explains why it is so convincing to the person producing it. It does not arrive as anxiety, which they would recognize and distrust. It arrives as clarity. The internal experience is one of everything suddenly making sense, of confusion lifting, of finally understanding what was obscured before. This is characteristic of threat responses generally, which produce narrowed focus and a powerful sense of certainty as a byproduct of urgency rather than of insight. The avoidant is not lying when they describe the clarity. They are accurately reporting a sensation that has nothing to do with the accuracy of what they now believe. A fifth element concerns the accuracy of what gets offered during the rush, which is frequently startling. Avoidants returning often identify with real precision exactly what was missing, name the specific failure that went unacknowledged for years, and demonstrate exactly the availability whose absence produced the ending. This precision feels like proof of transformation and is usually something else, the product of a long period with no defensive pressure present, which permits accurate identification of what was needed without conferring any ability to sustain it. Knowing which thing was missing is a diagnostic achievement rather than a therapeutic one, and the gap between the two is where the second departure eventually occurs. And there is a fourth element, the most uncomfortable of all. The intensity of the rush is proportional to the finality of the departure, rather than to the depth of the feeling. A person who leaves ambiguously produces a mild response. A person who leaves completely produces an overwhelming one. This means the magnitude of the reaction cannot be read as a measurement of anything except how thoroughly the exit was executed, which strips it of the meaning it appears to carry. The escalating sequence and what each stage reveals. The rush is not a single event, but a series of attempts, deployed in a predictable order, and each failure produces the next. The sequence is worth understanding because its progression discloses more than any individual stage. The first stage is the warmth offensive, a burst of attention, affection, and availability calibrated precisely to restore the previous arrangement. This has always worked before because it addresses hope, and hope responds instantly to evidence. Against someone genuinely finished it fails structurally, since there is no hope remaining for it to activate. The warmth arrives, is received politely, and produces no change in trajectory, which the avoidant experiences as deeply confusing because the tool has never failed. The second stage is the articulate explanation. Avoidants are frequently precise about their own limitations, and this precision has always purchased patience by demonstrating self-awareness. It fails here because the currency was always an implicit promise that understanding would eventually become different behavior. Once someone has concluded that conversion is not coming, every explanation describes a permanent condition rather than a temporary one, and descriptions of permanence do not generate patience. The third stage is the appeal to shared history, invoking significant moments as evidence that the connection warrants preservation. This fails because the person who has finished already conducted that review privately, weighed those moments against everything else, and reached a total. The invocation is not new information, it is a summary of a completed calculation, and it lands as an attempt to reopen a settled matter. The fourth stage is the reduced offer, in which some diminished version of the connection is proposed to preserve access, without accepting the obligations closeness would require. Its refusal is the most instructive of all, because what is being declined is not the avoidant's worth, but the sufficiency of what they are capable of providing, which is a considerably more precise and less answerable judgment. The fifth stage, when the others have exhausted themselves, is the manufactured urgency, a crisis, a dramatic disclosure, or a declaration of feeling that contradicts everything demonstrated for years. This works on someone still invested, because urgency overrides evaluation. Against a person who is finished, it fails for a reason difficult to accept. The intensity has become evidence rather than persuasion, proving that the capacity existed and was withheld. The maneuver argues the case against itself. There is something further in the progression that the avoidant registers before they can name it. Each maneuver was designed not merely to restore the relationship, but to restore a particular position within it, one in which they remained the person being pursued, and therefore the person whose participation was in question. Every successful deployment reconfirmed that arrangement. Their collective failure does not simply leave the relationship unrepaired, it relocates the avoidant into the position they have spent their entire life avoiding, that of the one who wants more than they are receiving. This relocation is the source of the disproportionate distress that follows, and it explains why avoidants at this stage frequently exhibit behaviors they would previously have found incomprehensible in other people. There is a sixth stage that appears only after the previous five have exhausted themselves, and it is the one that most often succeeds where the others failed. It is the withdrawal of the pursuit itself, executed with visible dignity, accompanied by an acceptance of the outcome and a statement that the person's decision will be respected. This arrives as relief after the escalating pressure of everything preceding it, and relief is disarming. It also functions, whether intended or not, as the single most effective remaining maneuver, because it removes the resistance a person had been braced against and leaves them holding an unopposed decision with nothing to push against. Many people who withstood every earlier stage find their position softening here, and the softening is worth recognizing for what it is rather than mistaking it for a change in circumstances. What the accumulated failures produce is a recognition no argument could have delivered. The avoidant discovers that their entire influence in the relationship was borrowed rather than owned. Every tool functioned because the other person wanted it to function, and their effectiveness ended when that wanting stopped. The power they believed they held was on loan throughout, extended voluntarily by someone who has now called it back without discussion. Why the same person cannot sustain what they are offering. The most reasonable question anyone in this position asks is whether the transformation could be real, and the answer requires examining what would actually have to change for it to hold. The first requirement is tolerance, which is physical rather than intellectual. An avoidant experiencing closeness generates a genuine alarm, and staying requires remaining present while that alarm sounds without acting on it. This is built through repeated exposure that is not escaped, and every escape resets the progress. A person in the middle of a surge has not built any of it, because the surge itself is the alarm operating in a different direction and provides no exposure to the discomfort that actually drives the pattern. The second requirement is a revised relationship with the origin of the pattern. Avoidance solves a problem that predates the current relationship entirely, and as long as that original problem remains unexamined, the solution keeps getting applied to situations that do not call for it. This work requires looking directly at material the entire personality was organized around not looking at. And a surge produces no motivation to do so, because the surge is aimed at removing discomfort rather than examining it. The third requirement is the willingness to be disappointing over time. Every avoidant carries a private conviction that full disclosure of their limitations would end the relationship, which drives the preemptive withdrawal that ends it anyway. Holding a connection requires remaining present while imperfect, allowing frustration without treating it as a verdict. A surge involves the opposite, an intensified performance of the best possible version, which is unsustainable precisely because it is a performance of something rather than the tolerance of being seen without one. The fourth requirement is the surrender of the exit as a standing option. Most avoidants who appear committed are in fact present with the door unlocked, which produces a withheld quality that partners can feel without identifying. A surge does not close the door, it reopens it enthusiastically, which is a different action entirely and frequently mistaken for the same thing. A fifth requirement underlies all the others and is rarely identified, the ability to name an internal state as it occurs. Most avoidance is not a decision to leave, but a failure of language, in which an unidentifiable pressure builds until action becomes the only available release. Someone who can say that they are feeling crowded, or frightened, or overwhelmed in the moment it happens has converted an impulse into information, and information can be discussed rather than obeyed. A surge does not build this vocabulary. It bypasses it entirely, substituting a single overwhelming signal for the fine discrimination that would actually be required, which is why the period of intense reaching so often ends with the avoidant unable to explain what happened to it. There is also a question of how long the surge can be sustained, and the answer is more specific than most people expect. Emergency states are metabolically expensive and cannot be held indefinitely. They resolve either when the threat is eliminated or when the resources maintaining them are depleted. In practice, this means the extraordinary availability has a duration measured in weeks rather than months, and it ends whether or not the reconciliation occurs. An avoidant whose reaching is declined does not continue reaching forever. The surge subsides on its own schedule, and what remains afterward is a person who feels the loss genuinely and possesses exactly the same capacity they had before, which is the state most of these situations settle into permanently. What follows from all four is the conclusion the surge is constructed to avoid. Commitment is something an avoidant does to themselves, slowly, at considerable cost, and no partner can perform any portion of it on their behalf. The best possible conditions do not make it happen, they only make it possible. And a period of intense reaching, however sincere, is not the beginning of that work, but a highly effective substitute for it. What the rush costs, the person watching it. The practical question is not what any of this means about the avoidant, but what it does to the person on the receiving end. And this is where the genuinely useful understanding lies. The first cost is the discarding of ground already covered. Ending something with an avoidant is unusually expensive, requiring grief conducted alone, without the closure most endings provide, frequently while continuing to hope. Reopening the connection does not resume the relationship where it stopped. It discards the entire recovery and requires it to be undertaken again with less energy available and considerably less confidence in the possibility of completing it. The second cost is exposure to a sequence that can be described in advance. An initial period of unusual warmth and apparent transformation, followed by the gradual return of the original pattern as the emergency recedes, followed by a second departure arriving faster and with less explanation. The second version is worse than the first because it removes the ability to believe the outcome was ever uncertain. The third cost concerns a person's relationship with their own judgment. A decision reached carefully, at considerable expense, and then reversed under pressure teaches something corrosive, that private conclusions do not hold, that a sufficiently compelling appeal overrides them, and that internal certainty is provisional. This lesson generalizes far beyond the situation that produced it, into every subsequent circumstance requiring the ability to trust one's own assessment. The fourth cost is the reintroduction of a specific and exhausting occupation. Relationships of this kind consume an enormous quantity of background processing devoted to interpreting behavior, anticipating retreats, and managing ongoing uncertainty. Ending it releases that capacity gradually, usually noticed only in retrospect. Reopening reclaims the territory immediately and completely. The fifth cost is one that accumulates invisibly during any period of holding a connection open, even passively. A person waiting for a resolution tends to defer decisions in small increments, keeping circumstances flexible enough to accommodate an outcome that has not arrived, declining opportunities that would complicate it. None of these deferrals registers as significant individually. Collected across several years, they amount to a substantially narrowed life, and the narrowing becomes visible only after enough has accumulated to be difficult to reverse. The relationship rarely produces the damage people brace for. It produces this instead, quietly, while attention is directed elsewhere. The sixth cost concerns what the rush does to a person's reading of themselves, which is more consequential than anything it does to the relationship. Most people emerging from this kind of dynamic carry a quiet conviction that they were too much, too intense, too demanding, because that is what the pattern appeared to communicate across years. Declining the return does something to that conviction which no reassurance accomplishes, because it demonstrates in action that the standard being applied was reasonable throughout. Accepting it does the opposite, confirming that the requirements were negotiable and therefore were never requirements. The decision functions primarily as a statement made to oneself, and the person it most needs to convince is the one making it. There is one further thing worth naming, because it tends to arrive later and catches people unprepared. Watching the rush and declining it does not produce triumph. It usually produces a flat, unremarkable sadness, and the absence of any satisfying feeling causes many people to wonder whether they made an error. The absence is not evidence of error. Satisfaction would require the decision to have been about the other person, and a decision genuinely made for oneself does not generate that particular reward. What it generates instead is quieter and considerably more durable, the ordinary experience of a matter being closed. And the final understanding is the one that resolves what the rush actually was. It was never a demonstration that the relationship was undervalued and has now been correctly reassessed. It was a system encountering, for the first time, a cost attached to its own behavior and producing the maximum available response to eliminate that cost. The response is real, the feeling behind it is real, and neither fact changes what the person underneath is capable of sustaining once the cost disappears again. Watching them rush back is genuinely satisfying to witness, and there is no reason to pretend otherwise or to feel any discomfort about the satisfaction. It is simply not information about the future, and treating it as information is how the same year gets lived twice. The surge answers a question nobody was asking, which is whether the feeling was ever real. It was. That was never in doubt to anyone paying attention, and it was never the variable that determined how any of this would go. The question that actually mattered was always a different one, concerning what the person underneath could sustain once the emergency passed and the ordinary requirements of closeness resumed, and a rush back provides no evidence about that at all. It cannot, because it occurs precisely in the conditions where the requirements are suspended. What the person watching it holds afterward is therefore not a decision about whether they were loved. That has been settled, generously and at some length, by someone finally saying everything they should have said years earlier. What they hold is a decision about whether being loved by someone with this particular limitation is sufficient, and that question was answered privately, over a long period, before any of this began. The rush is loud enough to make it feel entirely unanswered again. It is not. It is simply being asked one final time by a person who has finally run out of other ways to ask.